All right, kiddos. So we are going to do a video lecture on the Bill of Rights. That's the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. There are 27 amendments total. Eventually in the class, we'll get to all of them. But the 10 Bill of Rights, we're going to look at these as part of our intro to the U.S. Constitution. When we get to the unit that has civil rights and civil liberties, we'll look a lot more in depth at these. We'll look at court cases that have decided the fine-tuning of these amendments and what they mean, things that our government has done. Is it constitutional? Is it not? So we'll look a lot more in depth, but this right now is just a big old overview of the first 10 amendments. Now, if you remember from history, these amendments were added during the process of ratification. They were actually added as a compromise because the Anti-Federalists, if you remember, the Anti-Federalists were very worried about the big national federal government, tyrannical, taking away rights. And so these Bill of Rights are kind of added. And by 1789, when the Constitution is ratified, they're almost like, if you've heard that expression, get it in writing, that's what this was. So they're all these things are freedoms protected and rights given that cannot be taken away by the federal government when the Constitution was written. Now, there's a process called incorporation that throughout American history has happened, where the courts have now, for almost all of these, they apply these amendments not just to the federal government, telling the federal government you can't take away these various rights, but they also now apply to state governments as well. So really the expansion of these rights to all levels of our government have been going on. As we say, our Constitution is a living Constitution. So, all right, so big overview. A few of these, you need to take notes because a few of these, they have several parts. There's some examples I'm going to give you that you probably want to write down the examples. And then you can kind of have them memorized in class. I'll try to tell you ways to remember these. There's some tricks I can give you. So you'll be able to rattle these off and impress your friends. All right. First Amendment. Our header here on the slide says the Bill of Rights. Again, these are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So now we're just going to talk, though, on this slide about the First Amendment. There are 5 clauses to this amendment, 5 parts. You need to know them all. An acronym, RAPPS, can kind of help jog your memory about these. Okay, R is religion. I'm going to go in a different order here on the slide. But freedom of speech, first thing. That's the first thing out of the gate for the First Amendment. Self-explanatory. We'll talk a little bit about when all of our rights can be limited in some way. So we'll talk on another slide about fine-tuning this freedom of speech. The second part is freedom of religion. Now, there's 2 clauses to this religion clause, and if you go read the actual text, you'll be able to pick this out in there. But these are now referred to really as the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. Teaching by example, I'll tell you how this could look in the real world. So when you come to school, you're working or you're at school for the government, right? So these amendments apply to the government. You can pray. You can pray to any God you want. You can pray anytime you want. You cannot be stopped from that. That's called the free exercise clause. You are free to exercise your religion, okay? The establishment clause, though, says that governments cannot establish a religion for the people. So, you can't come to school and the school can't say, we are now all going to pray. If you don't pray, you're going to get suspended. They can't do that. That would be violation of the establishment clause. But they can allow you, they have to allow you to pray. Okay? Again, there are restrictions to this. Okay? If your religion says that you are going to sacrifice babies, that's not going to be protected. Okay? So, moving on to the third part, freedom of the press. This is media, TV, newspaper, all of this. Again, there's limitations to what the press can print, but courts over time have given a lot of freedom to the press. Sometimes we call the press the 4th branch of government because they're the one that they keep eye on our government, make sure they're doing the right things, we hope. The 4th part of the First Amendment, freedom to assemble, to gather, to protest out on the Capitol grounds, right? And the 5th Amendment is to petition your government for what they say in the Constitution, a redress of grievances. So you can petition your government. We want something changed. We want a law changed, all of that. Okay, so RAPPS, religion, assembly, press, petition, speech. Okay, if you can remember that acronym, you can remember these. All right, let's look at the limits on the First Amendment. Slander and libel. This actually is kind of freedom of speech and a little bit freedom of the press. You're not free to slander someone, which the definition there says knowingly and maliciously lying about someone. If you do this in print, they call that libel. Now, on another day in another unit, we talk more about the specifics of this. What is slander? What is libel? That's up for you to prove in a court. Does the court agree with you? In some cases, people might get money from maybe the media if they did this. But, somebody typing on Facebook, I don't like so-and-so because she's whatever, nasty things, that's not going to be slander. That's not going to hold up in court. So more on that later. All right, the rest of the Bill of Rights. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. This is constantly in the news. It's controversial. The courts are very favorable to the Second Amendment. Okay, are there restrictions on your right to own weapons? Of course there are. You can't own a tank. You can't build a nuclear weapon in your backyard. There are things like that. But over time, depending on what political parties are in power, we see either more or less restrictions on the ability of people to get a hold of weapons. The Third Amendment, little known, not really something we think about now. It was a big problem prior to the American Revolution. Citizens cannot be forced to quarter, meaning house soldiers. So the U.S. Army can't say, hey, these people are back from Fort Bragg. They're going to stay in your house. You got to feed them. You got to clothe them. Weirdly, there are some cases in very recent history where the government has violated this right. But they, as far as I know, none of these have ended up in court. So again, little known one, doesn't seem to happen very much. The Fourth Amendment, no illegal search and seizure. Law enforcement must have a search warrant signed by a judge following various rules. Also probable cause. When the cops stop you, there's certain things. They have to have probable cause if they're going to look in your trunk or whatever. We'll look at cases. Kids always have questions about the Fourth Amendment. Can they do this? Can they do that? We'll talk about that in more depth when we get to the unit on civil rights and civil liberties. Now, the Fifth Amendment, similar to the first, there are 5 parts. I'm going to go through these. Make sure you understand them, okay? Take notes. Write down a real-world example. So, Fifth Amendment deals with the rights of the accused, okay? First one is one that it might be unfamiliar to you, but if you've watched enough news, you might have seen this come up or heard this term. The first part of the Fifth Amendment says no one can be tried for a felony unless they've been indicted by a grand jury. That term, indicted. This is not a jury of your peers like you see in the movies with the people they pull off the street and they're on the jury. This is what's known as a grand jury. There are people picked by the court system to be part of a grand jury. The purpose of indictments in felony offenses. Back in the colonial days, you can't just round up a bunch of colonists, and then say we're going to accuse them of some crime. Grand juries, they look at evidence and they say, they don't decide guilt or innocence, but they look at the evidence and they say, is there even enough here to warrant the state taxpayer dollars doing a trial, right? And so if there's enough evidence, maybe there's eyewitnesses to something, whatever, then if they see fit, they will indict that person. Then, once you're indicted, then you go through the trial process. There's no indictments for misdemeanors, and some other little things that we can look at later. The second part of the Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy. This is one everybody knows, sort of famous. You cannot be tried for the exact same crime twice. If you have a hung jury, if you have a mistrial, you can definitely be tried again for that. You can be tried for one crime in in criminal court, and then in a civil court for that same crime. None of that is double jeopardy. But if you go through an entire trial process for armed robbery and you're found not guilty, the state cannot say, we're going to try you again. We don't like that result. The third part is protection against self-incrimination. And self-incrimination, you've seen this in the movie, people say, I'm going to plead the fifth. This basically just means if you're on trial, you do not have to speak in your own defense. You might actually hurt your case, okay? So a lot of times, let the lawyers do the talking, right? The fourth part is due process. Due process is just a fancy term for following proper procedure. So as you know, you've seen enough cop movies and legal movies. You got to get that one phone call. You have to be read your Miranda rights. All of these things fall under thousands of things that are known as due process, okay? And the courts have decided over the years what falls under due process. The fifth one is imminent domain. Government, believe it or not, they can take your property. They can take your home. as long as they compensate you fairly, meaning they pay a fair rate for whatever property they're taking, they follow due process in this, and they're taking that property for something for the public good, okay? Expanding an airport, or, I don't know, building a courthouse or a school or something like that. Eminent domain doesn't happen very often. There are weird cases. The border wall that is supposedly going to get built that probably never will. There might be people living on the border that have ranches on the border that the government would have to confiscate their property under eminent domain, stuff like that. Sixth Amendment, this is the trial portion, is the Sixth Amendment. These four probably are familiar to you if you've watched enough TV. Trial by a jury of your peers, you have that right. You have the right to a speedy and public trial. Trials are public, okay? We can't be locked. Public can't not see what's going on. The third one, right for you, if you're accused, to confront witnesses that say you might have committed this crime, or your accuser themselves. And the fourth one is the right to an attorney, okay? So again, the Sixth Amendment is the trial process. Jury, speedy trial, right to confront witnesses and accusers, and the right to an attorney. Wrapping them up, the Seventh Amendment, in civil cases, the Constitution says in cases worth more than $20, which, that was in the 1780s. But that's a civil case. You have the right to a jury. So if you're ever sued in civil court for something, you have the right to a jury trial. Most people don't do this. What's a civil case? You ever watch Judge Judy? Most of these are civil cases, right? They usually deal with money or something like that. The Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment and no excessive bail, okay? What is excessive? Well, it depends how bad the crime is, how much money you may have. Britney Spears is going to have higher bail than you and I would. Cruel and unusual punishment, all these things have been defined over time by the court. There was actually a time in this country in the 1970s where the death penalty was banned. All across the United States, they considered it cruel and unusual punishment. Different court later overturned that. The Ninth and Tenth Amendment, these are arguably the most important of the Bill of Rights passed after the First Amendment. Kids confuse them. Listen carefully. There's a little bit of a difference, even though they both deal with the rights of the people. The Ninth Amendment, basically what this says is enumerated rights. Enumerated, if you remember, means things specifically spelled out. So the enumerated rights listed in the Constitution, that's referring to 1 through 8 that we just covered. Those enumerated rights are not the only rights given to the people, okay? So we have other rights. The people that wrote the Constitution, they don't need to write down 1.5 million rights. They write down 1 through 8, and 9 says people have other rights, okay? So how do we know we have the right to pick our nose in the car? Well, the Ninth Amendment, right? And then finally, the 10th Amendment. This one says powers not specifically given to the federal government, not enumerated. Now, this is powers, okay? So this isn't 1 through 8. This is our articles that we looked at. So powers not specifically expressed and enumerated as powers granted to the federal government, coining money, running a post office, declaring war, all of those things that we looked at in the articles and we'll look at further. All these other things that aren't listed to the federal government are given to state governments. And in the 10th Amendment, what it actually says is these other powers are reserved to the states. So when you hear reserved powers, think state powers. What are some state powers that we have? I mean, running elections, running schools, believe it or not, drug laws, all of these things, they're not specifically mentioned in the Constitution as being given to the federal government. So in theory, they're all reserved to the states, okay? Now in practice, courts over time sometimes have decided that, believe it or not, some things that, 200 years ago we might say were state powers, today the federal government has used other parts of the Constitution to have those powers. So more for another day, right? Okay, so go back, review this, memorize these, figure out ways to help you kind of remember these. The first is tricky, the fifth is tricky, the ninth and 10th are tricky. Only through memorization are you going to be able to get this, okay? And now you need to go do your real world activity. It's going to show you some scenarios of real world violations of the Bill of Rights. You need to tell me which amendment is it and specifically what was violated. Cool? All right. Good luck.